The lights in the New York studio were blinding. Every camera angle was perfectly rehearsed. Every flag behind the panel table carefully selected France, Ghana, the U.S., South Africa, like a theatrical backdrop for diplomacy. This wasn't just another talk show. This was Future Voices Bridging Generations. A televised clash of worlds, legacies, and ideologies. And oh, the producers were hungry for controversy. On the left side of the polished mahogany table sat President Ibrahim Traoré, cool and composed in a dark tailored suit. His hands were folded, his back straight, his eyes calm, like a man who had stood in front of tanks and never flinched. On the opposite end sat Baron Trump, tall, sharp-jawed, perfectly postured in a navy suit that likely cost more than the average citizen's yearly salary. At only 19, he was already carrying the echo of a legacy that had once shaken the world. The contrast was cinematic. Traoré, the battle-forged leader from Africa, silent but heavy with experience. Baron, the media-polished heir of Western power, confident, ready to spar. The host barely finished the welcome before Baron leaned toward the mic, flashing that trademark smirk. I think we need to stop pretending that people like Mr. Traoré are liberators, he said. You can put a suit on tyranny, but it's still tyranny. The studio fell dead silent. One camera operator actually whispered, "Whoa," under his breath. The moderator blinked. Frozen. A few audience members looked genuinely stunned. But Traoré, he didn't blink. He didn't twitch. He leaned forward. Just slightly. And his voice was low but sharp. I came here to talk about the future, he said. But you, son, you came here to rehearse your father's script. And just like that, the tension snapped like a rope pulled too tight. Baron raised an eyebrow, feigning amusement. With all due respect, he said, when you rule by force, you forfeit the right to talk about the future. Traoré inhaled once, slow and deliberate. Then he leaned back, glanced around the room, and delivered a line that would break the internet in minutes. Sit down. Kid. The adults are speaking. Gasps. One of the camera guys dropped his lens cap. A panelist to the right chuckled. And somewhere in the control room, a producer whispered, "We've got viral gold." Hashtags were already forming. Memes hadn't even been made yet. But the captions were locked and loaded. And Baron Trump Young, polished, proud, had just walked into the lion's den, thinking it was a stage. He didn't realize the man across from him wasn't here to argue. He was here to teach. And class had just begun. Baron Trump leaned back in his chair, trying not to show it, but the crack in his armor had already formed. He adjusted his cufflink, offered a smirk to the cameras, and fired back. No disrespect, Mr. Traoré, but maybe where you're from, power is taken. Over here, it's earned. It was slick, rehearsed, the kind of line that plays well in a TikTok clip. But Traoré didn't take the bait. He didn't even blink. Instead, he gave a quiet nod, as if to say, "All right, let's play." He leaned back, slow and composed, then turned to face Baron directly and speak. "You did," Traoré replied, his voice smooth as glass, like a teenager who thinks the world began the day he was born. Laughter rippled across the panel. One American senator coughed to hide his grin. The moderator straightened his tie, clearly losing control of the room. Baron's smirk twitched. "I've studied global politics." He shot back. "I've read history. I don't need lectures from someone who censors the press and jails his critics." Traoré didn't raise his voice. He didn't even look insulted. He just gave a slight, almost pitiful smile. "And yet here you are," he said, "repeating headlines like gospel. You studied us through articles written by the people who own your airwaves. That's not knowledge, son. That's permissioned ignorance." Boom. Another ripple. The studio wasn't quiet anymore. It was charged. "Let's keep this respectful," the moderator interjected. A little too late. Traoré turned his gaze calmly toward him. "Respect starts with listening," he said. "Not lecturing someone who's fought for his people. While you were what? On TikTok?" Baron chuckled dryly, brushing it off. "So now I'm just a kid with a phone." Traoré tilted his head. "No," he said slowly. "You're a symbol. Not of evil, of something more dangerous. Of what happens when power is handed down without the weight of sacrifice." A beat of silence. Even the producers in the booth paused. Their fingers hovered over the commercial cut button, but nobody pressed it. Caroline Levitt, seated 2 chairs down, jumped in, trying to cool things down. "Let's not forget," she said. "Mr. Traoré has a military background. He's trained in intimidation." But Traoré didn't flinch. "And yet here I am," he said, "speaking, not shooting." Another blow, delivered with surgical precision. "I came to build bridges," he continued. "But if you hand me bricks soaked in condescension, don't be surprised if I throw one back." Baron looked to his left, then to his right. But none of the panelists came to his defense. Not this time. His polished confidence wavered. For the first time, he seemed unsure. The camera zoomed in. His jaw tightened. "I don't need to sit down," he said, voice louder now. "I was invited here to speak just like you." "And speak?" "You did," Traoré said again. This time, with a touch of quiet pity. "But speaking isn't the same as saying something worth hearing." A sharp breath from the crowd. Baron clenched his hands. "You don't know me." Traoré nodded. "True. But I know your type." Another gut punch. Delivered not with malice, but experience. You walk into a room like this, thinking you're the main character. You mistake inheritance for insight. And when someone challenges you, you reach for sound bites instead of substance. Baron tried to interrupt, but Traoré wasn't finished. "You say power should be earned," he said. "Then tell me, what have you earned? What have you risked? What have you bled for silence?" Even the live chat feed, streaming across the studio's digital board, slowed for a second. Then, like a dam breaking, comments began pouring in. "This is savage. Baron just got dismantled. This ain't a panel. It's a masterclass." Baron shifted uncomfortably in his seat. For the first time all night, he didn't have a comeback, just a long stare. And beneath that stare, the beginning of doubt. And Traoré, he didn't gloat. He didn't grin. He just sat back, calm and centered, because he hadn't come to win the debate. He'd come to change it. Baron Trump stared at the floor for half a second too long. The swagger was still in his posture, but the certainty, it had left the building. He looked up slowly, trying to recalibrate. He was a trump. After all, he was raised to dominate rooms, to win, to control the narrative. But right now, the narrative was running without him, and the man writing it was sitting across the table, as still and commanding as a statue carved out of resolve. Traoré hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't thrown a tantrum. But somehow, he had flipped the entire power dynamic with nothing more than composure and truth. Then, something even more unexpected happened. "I don't hate you, Baron," Traoré said, voice calm, eyes steady. "In fact, I understand you." That shook the room. "You were born into a system that told you you'd always be at the center, that every table was set for you, every spotlight already yours. But this room," he motioned slowly around the stage, "this world, it's changing. And if you want a real seat at the table, you're gonna have to do more than just show up with your father's name." Baron blinked. He didn't move. He didn't smirk. He just listened. Caroline Levitt leaned over and whispered something to him, but for the first time all night, Baron didn't respond. His gaze stayed locked on Traoré. Because whether he wanted to admit it or not, he was learning. He had walked into this debate to dominate. But somewhere between sit down, kid, and now, he'd become a student. "I guess," Baron finally said, voice quieter. "I've never really had to fight for anything." Traoré nodded slowly. "That's not your fault," he said, "but it becomes your responsibility the moment you realize it." The control room producers were in chaos. Engagement numbers were through the roof. Twitter was melting. Live chat was flowing faster than the screen could process. But inside the studio, you could hear a pin drop. Baron leaned forward, elbows on the table. "How do you carry that?" he asked. "The way you speak, the way you own the room." Traoré looked him dead in the eyes. "Because I buried friends in it." Baron flinched. "I didn't win a popularity contest," Traoré said. "I stood between a militia and a school full of children once. I led a movement with no promise of tomorrow. That's how I earned this seat. Not with a handshake. With scars, even off camera." The silence was thunderous. The room was still. Every panelist, every producer, even the moderator, no one dared speak. Because this wasn't politics anymore. This was something sacred. Baron opened his mouth to reply, then closed it again. He had nothing. And for once, that was exactly what the moment needed. A technician counted down to commercial break. But right before the screen went black, Baron asked one last question. "Why didn't you humiliate me?" Traoré didn't hesitate. "Because then I'd be no different than what I stand against." Cut to commercial. But backstage, the air was electric. Baron stayed seated, scrolling through his phone. Thousands of comments. Memes. Sure, but not the kind that mocked him. The kind that surprised him. Respect to Baron for not walking off. This is what growth looks like. He got schooled. But he stayed and listened. And across the table, Traoré noticed, "Leadership," he said softly, "isn't about winning every exchange. It's about knowing when silence speaks louder than pride." Baron looked up. "Is that how you do it?" "No," Traoré replied. "That's how I survived it." There was no dramatic score. No applause. Just two men, divided by age and origin, finally speaking the same language. Experience. And that night, something shifted. Not just in Baron, but in every young viewer watching from home. They didn't see a clash of titans. They saw what happens when ego meets authenticity. When the cameras returned, the class wasn't over. It had just reached its turning point. The studio lights came back on, but the energy in the room completely different. The audience wasn't leaning back anymore. They were forward, eyes sharp, hands still, waiting to see what came next. Even the host, now visibly shaken, cleared his throat as he tried to regain composure. Président Traoré, he said, "Some say your leadership style is too rigid, that you're unyielding, that you're," he hesitated, "the iron wall of Africa." Traoré didn't flinch. He looked straight at the moderator and said calmly, "An iron wall only rises when too many try to break in through the back door." Boom. The air was carved in two. Even Baron, who had regained some color in his face, looked stunned. And then, like clockwork, Traoré continued. "You ask why I'm uncompromising," he said. "Let me ask you this. Why should I compromise with those who only ask for my opinion after I've said no?" Dead silence. "Compromise is only noble when both sides come as equals." He added, "But when one party brings a leash and the other brings a backbone, that's not negotiation. That's colonization in a tailored suit." No one breathed. Even Caroline Levitt, who had tried to defend Baron earlier. I couldn't hide the discomfort on her face. "You sound like you don't believe in diplomacy," she finally said, attempting a reset. "I believe in diplomacy," Traoré said, "but I don't believe in being patted on the head while signing away my country's future." Gasps from the crowd. The chat feed was exploding. This man is rewriting the rules on live television. He's not shouting, he's slicing. Baron's learning more in one night than a semester at Harvard. And Baron, he sat in silence. Not out of fear, but out of recognition. Because suddenly, he understood. This wasn't about nations. This was about dignity. Traoré looked at him again. This time with something closer to mercy than challenge. "You think this is just politics?" he asked. "This is about whether people like me get to speak without translation. Whether I walk into a room like this, and I'm seen not as a guest, but as a man who earned his seat." Baron swallowed hard. "And I did earn it." Traoré continued. "With more blood than you'll see in a lifetime." The moderator tried to change course, scrambling for balance. "Président Traoré, where does this end? This refusal to play by the traditional rules, what does it actually achieve?" Traoré didn't hesitate. "It doesn't end," he said, "because freedom has no finish line." He looked directly into the camera. "It's not something you win once and hang on the wall. It's something you guard every day from enemies. From friends, even from your own history." The studio was still. You could hear the hum of the light rig. And then Baron Trump spoke again. But this time, not as a prince of power, not as a political brand, as a young man stripped of certainty. "I didn't come here expecting to respect you," he said. Everyone turned. "But I do now." Traoré didn't blink. He simply nodded firm. But not cold. "You don't need to like me," he said. "But you do need to understand. This world doesn't revolve around your flag." Baron looked down, then back up. "That part," he said quietly, "I'm still working on." "Good," Traoré replied. "That means you're waking up." And in that moment, the audience didn't see a takedown. They saw a transition. The fall of ego. The rise of understanding. The transformation of an heir into a student of reality. Outside, the protests still raged. But inside, something far more important was happening. Baron Trump, once armed with talking points, was now armed with a question he hadn't asked before. What does leadership really cost? And across from him sat a man who didn't just know the answer. He carried it in his voice. The lights in the studio never changed. But something else had something you couldn't capture with a camera. The air was thicker now. Not tense. Reverent. The moderator looked visibly shaken, flipping through his notes like a man, searching for a lifeboat in a rising tide. Baron sat quietly, hands clasped, no longer the brash heir to a name, but a man in the middle of something deeper. A reckoning. That's when the final question dropped. Président Traoré. The moderator asked, voice steadier than before. What is your ultimate goal in being here tonight? Why walk into a room where you knew you'd be outnumbered? Misunderstood. Even ridiculed, Traoré leaned forward just slightly. His voice, low but razor sharp, cut through the room. Because you can't change a system from the outside. If the doors stay closed, the audience froze. I came here, he said, not to be liked, not to trend. I came to force that door open, to say the things that aren't allowed in polite conversation, because polite conversation has never liberated anyone. The camera zoomed in as Traoré glanced across the panel at Baron, at Caroline, even at the moderator himself. You may not agree with me. You may not like how I speak. But tonight, you heard me. And whether you applauded or sneered, he paused. I did what I came to do. Then, Baron calmly, with a voice that was finally his own, leaned toward his mic. And what happens? He asked. When the cameras turn off, and the world goes back to ignoring voices like yours, without hesitation. Traoré answered. Then I raise my voice louder. Boom. But he wasn't done. He stood. Slowly. No dramatic music. No lights dimming. Just one man. Standing on his own terms. And don't mistake silence for surrender. He added, sometimes we go quiet. Just long enough to sharpen our words. He turned and walked off the stage, and the audience slowly at first, then all at once rose to their feet. No one clapped. Not yet. They just stood, because they knew they had witnessed something that didn't need applause to echo. Backstage, producers whispered, we just recorded the most important broadcast of the year. Meanwhile, Baron Trump remained seated, eyes forward, mouth shut. His world permanently shifted. He turned to the moderator, almost in disbelief. He didn't come here to win. Baron whispered. He came here to teach. And teach. I did. 2 days later. The internet hadn't moved on. Clips of Traoré's one-liners went viral. Sit down. Kid. Permissioned ignorance. This world doesn't revolve around your flag. I raise my voice louder. TikTokers lip-sync them. Instagram filled with fan edits. But it wasn't just the memes. It was the meaning. In high schools, students debated the exchange in history class. On college campuses, professors re-aired the segment. And in private boardrooms, where power used to feel so safe, executives asked each other, did you hear what he said about dignity for the first time? Young people weren't quoting Baron Trump. They were quoting the man who made him listen, Ibrahim Traoré. And in Ouagadougou, there were no fireworks, no parades, just dusty streets and children waving red, green, and gold paper flags they'd drawn themselves. He had returned without celebration, but everyone knew he had come back from a different kind of battlefield, one without guns, one more dangerous, a battlefield of perception. Back at the presidential compound, an aide handed him the full transcript of the debate. Traoré read through it slowly, until he reached one line. "Don't mistake silence for surrender." He smiled faintly. "Was it worth it?" "Mr. President," the aide asked. Traoré stared out the window. Voice calm. "Some rooms," he said, "you enter to speak. Others, to remind them you were never gone." That night, as the world scrolled past headlines and the spin machines did their work, something deeper lingered. Not in politics, in people. Because Baron Trump, once untouchable, had learned to listen. And Ibrahim Traoré, the man underestimated, dismissed, and mispronounced, had just opened the door wider than anyone expected. Not by shouting, not by force, but by standing still and telling the truth. 2 days after the broadcast, the headlines kept coming. But this time, they weren't spinning. They were listening. Baron Trump grows up on live television. Traoré's masterclass, own power, privilege, and presence. Sit down. Kid now trending in 39 countries. The phrase had become more than a meme. It became a movement. On college campuses across the U.S., students debated not who won the exchange, but why it hit so hard. In high school classrooms, history teachers paused their curriculum to ask, what is earned power and what is inherited performance on TikTok? Influencers recreated the moment, lip-syncing Traoré's calm yet devastating lines. But the comments said more than any video ever could. He didn't yell. He didn't flinch. He knew. Baron walked in to teach us about legacy. Traoré reminded us about sacrifice. This is what leadership feels like. And the most liked comment, real leaders don't demand the room. They earn it by walking in like it's not theirs. Meanwhile, Baron Trump stayed off camera. No press tours. No podcasts. No rehearsed damage control. Because even he knew this wasn't about saving face. It was about facing himself. In a private clip leaked from backstage, Baron was seen scrolling through thousands of messages on his phone. Some mocked him, but most didn't. Respect for staying seated. It takes more strength to shut up and listen. That moment, you realized your last name isn't enough. Baron stared at one comment longer than the rest. It read, "You didn't lose. You learned." And what about Traoré? He returned to Ouagadougou in silence. No media caravan. No hero's welcome. But something had changed. This time, he wasn't greeted by government officials. He was greeted by children waving hand-drawn flags, some holding cardboard signs that simply read, "We heard you." Inside the presidential compound, his team had gathered all the data, global engagement, surging youth support, debate viewership, breaking international records. But Traoré wasn't interested in numbers. He wasn't chasing applause. He was scanning something deeper: impact. One aide placed a printed transcript on his desk. On the front, bolded and underlined, was the phrase, "You don't need to like me, but you do need to understand, the world doesn't revolve around your flag. Traoré looked at it for a moment, then set it aside. He didn't need a reminder. He was the reminder. Meanwhile, at Georgetown University, a political science professor opened her lecture with a clip from the debate. Afterward, she turned to her class and asked, "What shook you more? The words Traoré used, or the silence Barron gave in return?" The room was quiet. Then a student in the back raised his hand. "Both," he said. "One showed us what power sounds like. The other showed us what humility finally looks like." Back in New York, the network boardroom played the full debate again, this time not to analyze, but to understand. Executives sat quietly. A senior producer turned and said, almost reluctantly, "We invited a spectacle and ended up broadcasting a reckoning." Another whispered, "You think Barron regrets showing up?" The reply came fast, "No. Because for the first time, he showed up as himself." And that, perhaps, was the greatest plot twist of all. Barron Trump came to win a televised argument. Instead, he walked away with something no legacy could hand him: clarity. He didn't become a legend, but he became real. And Ibrahim Traoré, he didn't raise his voice. He raised the standard. In the end, this wasn't just a panel. It was a mirror, held up to power, to privilege, to pretense. And while the world expected fire, Traoré gave them steel, cold, measured, unbending, the kind of presence that doesn't demand to be remembered, because it never needed permission to begin with.